Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar, Deciphering PCI DSS 4.0, How to Prepare Your Organization. A few logistics before we begin. As we go through the content, please insert any questions within the chat or Q&A windows. We will be monitoring it throughout the session and we'll pause to answer questions. The presentation will be provided to attendees post-session along with a link to the recorded session. So you don't need to scramble to write the content down as there's a lot we will be covering today. With that, let's go ahead and begin. Our objectives today will be to help you understand what the key changes are between PCI DSS 3.2.1 and 4.0 by reviewing the transition timeline issued by the Payments Council, reviewing the paradigm shift to approaching PCI DSS, and a preview of the new requirements. We're not going to be able to go over all the requirements, but we're going to go over as many as possible so we can help everyone out. So I'd like to introduce the presenters today. My name is Christina Whiting. I am the Principal of Privacy, Enterprise Risk, and Compliance at Tevora. I am joined by our Associate Manager of Payments, Bill Nguyen, who leads Tevora's payment practice and is going to be going over a lot of the technical content today. So with that, Bill, I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thanks, Christina. So starting out, let's go over the transition timeline and some key dates you should know to make sure that we're prepared for that future version. So there's 4 key dates outlined in this transition timeline graphic that I wanted to go over. The first one being the official release of 4.0, which was released at the end of last quarter, early this year. The second date that we should share is the QSA training and supporting documentation. In Q2 of 2022, for this year, the PCI SSE is planning to create training for our QSAs to be certified to provide that 4.0 training. To go through, each QSA needs to be certified in that 4.0 training to actually attest against 4.0. Third date is the retirement of PCI 3.2.1. So up to this point, you would be able to choose either 3.2.1 or 4.0 for your assessments, but right at Q1 of 2024, more specifically the 31st of March, that's when the 3.2.1 option is no longer available for you. So after that point, we'll be using 4.0 starting at 31st of March 2024. The fourth key date would be the effective date of the new PCI DSS requirements or quote-unquote future dated requirements. For those of you who remember that transition from 3.2 to 3.1, a lot of the new requirements were considered best practice. There was some sort of italicized note saying that this is best practice until this particular date. This is the same concept that will apply to 4.0. And the reason why future dated requirements is a special keyword is there are some variations that you should consider. So not all requirements, most requirements, but not all requirements are best practice until Q1 of 2025. If you look at the example on the left, this is an example of a net new requirement in 4.0. And if you point your attention down to the applicability notes in italics, it says this requirement is best practice until 31st of March 2025. This is for the majority of requirements, but there are some varying timelines you have to consider. For those of you considering early adoption of 4.0 before that Q1 2025 date, there are some requirements that are immediately effective upon using 4.0, this being one of them, where you can see the most important thing to see in this is the lack of that italicized language saying this is best practice. Later in the presentation, we'll go through these requirements in detail just to make sure that anyone who's planning to adopt it early will be prepared to do so.
Thanks, Bill. And so there's a huge paradigm shift when it comes to version 3.2.1 and 4.0 that we really wanted to double click on with everyone. And so this is in regards to what the council is calling a customized approach. Now, this is really the strategic side of the house when it comes to critical changes of 4.0. So, we'll look at strategic and tactical. Strategic meaning, there's going to be key changes to how organizations need to evaluate process, how they need to incorporate certain policy, and honestly, the most important one, how risk analysis is done, because they are moving to a more significant evaluation of a risk-based approach. And this is going to be one of those things where embedded in the organization's culture, there needs to be a paradigm shift of how you approach, think about, and apply PCI in regards to your cardholder data environment and the ecosystem as a whole. And so Bill is going to go over the details of how the council is defining the different paradigms of 321 as a defined approach and the new version under 4.0 in the customized approach.
So in 4.0, there's the introduction of this concept of defined approach versus customized approach. For those of you who have worked with 3.2.1, this is essentially the paradigm of the defined approach. They're just using that label to draw that boundary around what we originally thought of as PCI DSS, where there are requirements, there are testing procedures, the standard expected us to follow those requirements as explicitly described. And if there was some sort of technical or business constraint, there was an option to use compensating controls. So that would be the defined approach. In 4.0, there's now a second category called the customized approach, which really is more about the control objective. There are some parallels between compensated controls and customized approach, but the key difference here is that the customized approach is more risk-based, where we'll go into more details later in the slides as to when you would use a customized approach over a compensated control. But the key point here is that it's a risk-based approach that does require extensive process and documentation that is pushed over to the responsibility of the assessed organization rather than the external auditors. There's a good amount of work that needs to be done, documentation and process-wise, to maintain customized controls. But just know that this is an option in addition to the defined approach. So you don't have to choose one or the other. Generally, what we would expect is most requirements organizations will follow using the defined approach. There may be compensated controls here and there, but for a select few controls that just don't make sense from a risk perspective, as prescribed by the DSS, organizations will choose certain customized controls to maintain. So for the traditional approach, just as a refresh for everybody, I'm sure everyone has seen this type of structure. Main point is that it's pretty simple in 3.2.1 that there's a requirement, testing procedure as prescribed, and we have the option of compensating controls as long as we meet a certain set of criteria. So how is the customized approach different? So what it is a framework for allowing organizations to use alternative controls and you don't necessarily need to meet the requirements of compensating controls anymore. For instance, the business constraint is no longer needed. Why did they introduce this? The PCI SSE wanted to give more flexibility to organizations to do a more risk-based approach because there are certain controls that just don't make sense. It's not a perfect, sometimes it's fitting a square peg in a circular hole. So we're focusing on a risk-based approach, but it's more intended for risk-mature entities because of the amount of process and documentation you'd have to maintain for each of these controls. There is a bit of resource requirements associated with maintaining these, and we'll go into that in detail. So how do you define and design a customized approach objective? One, you have to align with the customized approach objective for your control, and we'll go into where that can be found in the standard in the next slide. Next, you'd have to the organization who's implementing the control has to design and perform testing not only for the existence and application or implementation of that control, but also the effectiveness of that control as well, and how well it does in mitigating the risk associated with the original intent of the control. Additionally, there would be processes to monitor the effectiveness of that control in both of those areas, implementation as well as risk mitigation. And the crowd favorite, thoroughly document and maintain evidence of all that activities above. And the last point is for each customized approach, the organization needs to conduct a targeted risk analysis, and we'll go into that in more detail in a second. But first, I want to point out that for the new standard in 4.0, for most of the requirements, there's going to be a section in the bottom left corner called the customized approach objective. Similar to how in compensated controls, we have to identify what the original intent of the control is. In 4.0, we don't have to do additional work to extrapolate that. The standard itself explicitly defines what that objective is. But there are some requirements that are not eligible for the customized approach. In this instance, for example, the storage of the security code after authorization, the PCI SSE does not want to see any way around that. But for most requirements throughout the DSS, most of them will be eligible for the customized approach objective. So this is a snippet from the Appendix D. No need to read through it, but the one thing I wanted to point out was there is a book there. We list out the criteria. This is a long form version of what we described in the how section in prior slides of how to do a customized approach control. One of the things they point to is this controls matrix template in Appendix D, and they require that all the information specified in this template is maintained. We'll go over that just to give you a bit of an overview of what kind of information they're asking for. Of course, it's details of the controls, how it's implemented, who's responsible, who's going to be managing and maintaining and monitoring these controls, as well as you'd have to make an argument and document your case as to why this is appropriate customized approach objective and how is it meeting the actual intent of that original requirement. Next, you have to go into describe the testing that was performed and the results of that testing. You'd have to describe the results of the risk analysis, and you'd have to describe the measures that's implemented to make sure that control is maintained over time. There's a lot of parallels between the compensating control worksheet that you may have seen in your QSA fill out in the past with this document, but now this document is meant for organizations to fill out rather than the assessing, the QSA to fill out.
Excellent. So one of the biggest hit areas that we feel are going to directly impact organizations is this concept of targeted risk analysis. So if any organization is used to dealing with ISO 27001, high trust, SOC 2, et cetera, you're used to those, standards and those bodies requiring the evaluation of risk based on certain decisions that you're making in the organization. Say, frequency of conducting vulnerability analysis, pen tests, control effectiveness, et cetera. Well, this concept is now being applied to PCI. And that's really what they're trying to look at when it comes to targeted risk analysis itself. It's embedding risk in the conversation around key decisions that the organization is making that directly affects the controls and the frequency of how you operate and manage your PCI program itself. And it goes to that. It's really around looking at enhancing your PCI program in the organization and evaluating and making sure that it's a risk-based approach for designing the controls and managing it. And so this is absolutely one of those concepts that is going to potentially increase some of the documentation. Even if it doesn't, it's going to increase the conversations that you have internally around decisions and then documenting the outcome of those decisions, because they're going to be used as input for your PCI QSAs, or even if you're doing an FAQ within your SAQs and stuff themselves. So Bill, why don't you help shed some light on some of the specific details on this targeted risk analysis?
Absolutely. So what is the targeted risk analysis? In addition, so in 3.2.1, we all know that there needs to be some sort of annual risk assessment. This is going to be in addition to that, where the targeted risk analysis is more of a micro assessment against focusing on a specific PCI DSS requirement. And the reasons as to why you would have to do a targeted risk analysis under 4.0 are twofold. One, for all customized approach controls, there has to be some sort of targeted risk analysis performed to justify the design of the control. And secondly, there are also several other new requirements that will be required these are going to be the net new in 2025, required in 2025, where you would have to conduct a targeted risk analysis to determine the appropriate frequency of certain controls, especially those that are occurring on a periodic basis. This may include how often you inspect point-of-sale devices, or how often you should train your incident response team, depending on the level of external threats that you're facing from the security perspective. So for the how, for those of you who are familiar with this assessment, this is not too different. The only difference here is that you're focusing on a specific control, but the essence of it is that you define a proposed control, you evaluate how that control would contribute to the impact and likelihood of a cardholder data breach from that perspective, as well as going through the process of documenting that risk, getting that approved, and having that reviewed at least on an annual basis. Very standard practice in the risk management programs we see in the industry. So when should you use a customized control rather than a compensated control? Why go through all of that process and documentation? If we direct our attention to the right side, let's start with compensated controls. You have to have some sort of legitimate business constraint or technical constraint, and it has to go, quote unquote, above and beyond existing PCI DSS controls. For instance, you can't say, oh, we have file integrity monitoring on this system because its file integrity monitoring is already required for PCI. Moving over to the left side, customized controls, we no longer need a business or technical constraint to justify why we don't want to put in that original control. We can technically leverage existing PCI DSS controls. For instance, maybe there's a host-based intrusion detection system that does much more than just that. Although that's already required for PCI DSS from a certain perspective, that can be reused as a customized control if the overall context of the risk for that system or that particular process is low enough to justify that. So the key point here is that you're allowed to do a risk-based approach. And the example that we were thinking of is, think about if you're managing an environment with employees working from home, and there are workstations that are considered in scope for PCI DSS in these individuals' homes. When we look at requirement 9, physical security, we look at the requirement visitor logs. Technically, there's no business or technical constraint that prevents us from having our employees maintain visitor logs to their room, but from a risk perspective, that just doesn't make sense. And that would be one example where a customized control makes much more sense than a compensated control. So going over, there is just as we saw with the customized control matrix, there is an example template for the targeted risk analysis. For any of these templates that the DSS provides in the appendix, organizations are not required to use these templates, but we're required to have the information that was requested there. So over at high-level overview, you'd identify the requirement and document that, describe and document the proposed solution, go through the analysis phase of analyzing the likelihood of this particular circumstance leading to a breach of cardholder data, identifying or analyzing the impact and documenting that as well, and documenting the risk and approval process and that annual review, including the next time this risk should be reviewed.
Excellent, thank you, Bill. So I wanted to pause real quick before we go into the new requirements. We did have a couple of questions come up, kind of monitoring the queue and everything in regards to, the content that we just went over in paradigm shifts. And so, Bill, the first one, just a clarifying question. So you mentioned that under PCI 4.0, we can use existing PCI controls as part of the customized control. Is that correct?
Yep, that is correct, because I guess for the customized controls, it doesn't necessarily need to be one customized control. The reason I gave that example is because the most important thing is to see the context in which that system and the risks that affect that system, right? Maybe there's a PCI requirement for a system that would apply to the system, but it doesn't touch cardholder data. And maybe there are segmentation controls where the environment is completely air-gapped, for example. Maybe that would be a better example, where network segmentation or the restriction of network ports protocols to what is necessary is already required. But if an environment is completely air-gapped or physically air-gapped, then that is technically an existing control that can't be really used as a compensated control. But that, from a risk perspective, that makes a large difference.
Okay, excellent. Another question that came up, obviously, risk assessment process is very individualized to an organization. So I totally get this question. I'm very passionate about it as well. So the question was regarding the risk assessment analysis. Do organizations have to use likelihood times impact, or can they use their own risk methodology that they've developed internally?
Good question. So it doesn't need to be restricted to just likelihood and impact. Of course, you can go above and beyond what the template is asking for, but one of the criteria that the variables in which we use to assess risk should include something that resembles likelihood and impact, whether it be broken down differently or reworded. It doesn't necessarily need to be set in stone with likelihood and impact as our only options.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill. Okay. So, transitioning into new requirements, so technical side of the house. So going into some of the critical changes associated with key technical controls. So under PCI 4.0, we're really going to start seeing, the council and everything in the standard taking into perspective newer technologies like, cloud-based environments that most organizations are in. Also looking at, serverless-based environments and how do you account for that within the control sets themselves. So Bill's going to go over how this is impacting really the technology that all of us are using today and how it relates back to the standard. So Bill, turn it back over to you.
Great. So preview of the new requirements. Overall, there are approximately 70 reworded requirements. So these are not necessarily net new requirements, but those that are reworded in a way to expand or adjust applicability. And we'll go over a couple of examples of those soon. Then there's approximately 80 new and evolving requirements. So that's why in the beginning, Christina had mentioned that we probably won't have time to cover all of them, but we handpicked 7 common scenarios to be covered and where there are significant changes that would impact a lot of organizations and may take a bit of time to implement. And so we wanted to make sure we covered those. So one example of a reworded requirement relates to modern network security. For the reworded requirements, we can see the theme that we see is it's reworded to either expand applicability for the types of systems, in this case, the modern network environment, and then the other one would be expanding the applicability of assets the requirement applies to. So starting with the first one, expanding the applicability of types of systems that are involved. As we can see in 3.2.1, they do mention the terminology firewall, router, DMZ. This is appropriate for environments who have a data center environment and administrators that are working directly with the appliances themselves. But with modern cloud architectures, those concepts have been extracted away from the administrator experience and consequently extracted away from the auditor experience as well. So the terminology now in 4.0, in this example, has been updated to install and maintain a network security control instead of firewall configuration. And the key updates here, for example, are firewall rules are now mentioned as network security control rule sets, and router and DMZ, those terms are not found in the requirement language anymore. So there's a bit more open-ended, more broadened opportunity to interpret the requirements for software-defined networks and implementations of maybe things like Kubernetes clusters where implementation of a DMZ doesn't necessarily make sense. The second type of requirement, we chose this example because it shows the rewording to expand the assets that these requirements would apply to. For instance, in 3.2.1, requirement 3 for protecting data at rest really just focused on cardholder data. And cardholder data is defined by the SEC as that, things like 16-digit number, expiration date, nothing to do with what's on the back of the card for the most part. In 4.0, requirement 3 was reworded to say account data instead. So now cardholder data and sensitive authentication data are included within that umbrella of what this requirement applies to. And sensitive authentication data being CVV, PIN numbers, track data, for example, anything that was meant to be separated from the cardholder data to make sure that there's some sort of authentication step for using that card. Okay, so diving into the new requirements, we wanted to start out to identify the requirements for any organizations considering adopting PCI DSS 4.0 a bit early before that Q1 of 2025 date. So in scenario 0, all of these requirements are required right upon using 4.0, even before 2025. The first of these requirements is more policy and procedure documentation to maintain about internal roles and responsibilities. In requirement 1 and requirement 12 of the 3.2.1 already had some of these requirements embedded. Essentially, those for those who remember, in requirement 12, there is documentation of who's responsible for security incident response, who's responsible for. There's specific requirements about defining roles and who would be responsible for overseeing and implementing the particular domains of various control sets. This is just replicated across requirements 2 through 11. Another requirement specifically for service providers is, looks like the PCI SSE was trying to resolve an issue with ambiguity between that demarcation of responsibilities between merchants and service providers. So now there's an explicit requirement for third-party service providers to provide detailed information about which requirements are going to be handled by the service provider and which are actually going to be needed to be the responsibility of the merchant. And generally, the best practice we've seen here is what many cloud architecture or cloud hosting providers provide, that responsibility matrix that goes through the requirement language and identifies, what that demarcation is, which one's a shared responsibility versus which is up to the service provider or merchant. Now, for all organizations, both merchants and service providers, there is an additional requirement around scoping validation. In 3.2.1, this was already required, but it wasn't necessarily within one of the numbered requirements. It was mentioned up at the top of the document at the very long summary and overview page that everyone generally skips. It does talk about the need to do annual scoping validation, but there was really no clear guidance onto how to do it. Now 4.0 introduces clear scoping and validation activities and makes it a requirement for an organization to do and document at least every 12 months. And this includes identifying data flows, updating data flow diagrams, identifying in-scope systems, and also identifying those tier 2, non-CDE, but in-scope or security impacting systems, etc. And the last control for early adopters would be target risk analysis for customized controls. We've gone through this in a bit more detail earlier in the presentation, but there is a specific requirement where a lot of the language will point to 12.3.2 to identify what you need to do for each targeted risk analysis and when it needs to be performed. So for any early adopters who are designing customized controls, targeted risk analysis will also be needed for that as well. Now moving on to scenarios where imagine we are in March 31st, 2025, and the requirements are fully effective. What do we have to prepare for? So in addition to doing targeted risk analyses for the customized controls, we now have to start doing risk analyses for determining various controls that are involving periodic cadence. Examples being malware. How often should your malware scanning tools be scanning periodically? If there are systems in the environment that you can just consider are low risk to malware, such as a lot of organizations say Linux systems do not need anti-malware, a targeted risk analysis needs to be done for how often should we evaluate our Linux systems or the threat to Linux systems again. And so we make sure we can keep up with that evaluation. Additionally, frequency of point-of-sale inspections, frequency of reviewing logs, and frequency of training for incident response personnel. So our next scenario is for anyone who is maintaining a web application, and for these next two requirements are specifically for those organizations maintaining a web application that has a payment page, generally an input field that is not embedded by an iframe, but input field that is created by the organization to take cardholder data from customers. So this first requirement is a pretty significant change. This requirement is all about restricting unauthorized scripts, where this is one of the efforts to defend against web skinning and the web skinning attacks that we've been hearing so much about lately. This one is a restrictive control where you would establish a allow list for any scripts that would be running on that payment page. Generally, across the industry, we would see content security policy being the most common implementation of this requirement. So in addition to creating that allow list for your web application payment pages, there's now a integrity check aspect to it as well. So you have to put in mechanisms to detect and respond to any unauthorized changes to payment pages. And essentially what that means is having some sort of mechanism to identify the expected behavior of your payment page. You would expect that page to be delivered to the end consumer browser, and then some way to see whether or not what's actually being loaded to end consumer browsers matches up or has any discrepancies with your expected baseline. A couple of example mechanisms. Right now, the most common would be using some reverse proxies or content delivery network solutions. I know a couple of services out there have specifically called page integrity solutions to detect any unauthorized script changes, especially from what is being delivered from the server side. Next, there are external web scanning and monitoring tools. In the industry, more so for performance monitoring, there's a service called synthetic user monitoring, which simulates what a user would do on your website, but using their servers or their machines to emulate those use cases and try to get more verbose data about that request and response exchange and the more granular details associated with that web request and response so that your organization has visibility into that user experience. This data can be repurposed, or providers of this can also repurpose this information to detect any integrity issues that might be an indicator of compromise. The last example that we've been hearing about are tamper-resistant libraries and plugins. At the moment, these are less common than the first two, but the strength of having a tamper-resistant or tamper detection library plugin potentially would be a JavaScript library, for example, running within the end user browser alongside the payment page scripts. So that means that the strength here is that the visibility is within the context in which and where the exploit is actually happening. And the other two, it's more so detecting unauthorized changes from the server side, what the server delivers, or what the third-party marketing company that we source scripts from delivers, or even, but it doesn't really necessarily, it wouldn't be able to detect things like reflection attacks or inline cross-site scripting from the client side that involve embedding malicious content script within the URL itself. So the third requirement you'd have to consider with your web application is not necessarily related to web skippers, but this is a key change where in 3.2.1, if you remember, you had the option to use some sort of periodic evaluation, security assessment against the code. This would generally be a code scanning solution, for example, or you had the option to use a web application firewall. In 4.0, now you only have one option. It's across the board, everyone's expected to implement something like a web application firewall. Now, scenario 3, that's a pretty significant change for a lot of organizations, is the consideration for access management for service accounts and application accounts. Here's a snippet from 3.2.1. You don't have to read through the whole thing, but this is the language that appears right above that table of requirements to elaborate on what the applicability is. And here we can extract from this that there are three categories that in 3.2.1, three categories of users that they cared about. One, it would be the administrators. Two, it'd be anyone with cardholder data access. And number three, anyone with access to the cardholder data environment. But in 4.0, this section explicitly calls out service and application accounts as well. So here is an overview of the requirements that you have to apply to the service and application accounts within your environment. Number one would be processes and mechanisms to restrict the interactive logon capabilities. So what interactive logon is just simply the ability for a user or a human to use the credentials of that system and application account to access a particular asset. An overview of the controls is first, there has to be some sort of business justification that's documented and approved for every account that's enabled with interactive login capabilities. There has to be a policy to only allow that for a quote unquote exceptional circumstance. And lastly, accounting controls or audit trails need to be implemented to tie activity to an individual user, even if it's a shared application account. This may be, we may expect to see multiple SSH keys assigned for a single application account, for example, just to make sure that each of those keys can contain a unique signature or some sort of correlation to the individual user using that key for that account, for example. The next area of controls that we'd have to consider for our service and application accounts is the password and credential security, particularly those around complexity, rotation, and hard coding. For the rotation requirements, fortunately, due to the difficulty of rotating service and application account credentials, the rotation can be based on a targeted risk analysis. So this can really help your organization not get overwhelmed with having to rotate all your application and service accounts every 90 days or so, for example. And the complexity of that, those credentials is contingent on how often you're going to be rotating, which is contingent on your assessment of the risk at hand. And lastly, another hard requirement is the interactive logon credentials for any application account or service account that does have interactive logon. Those credentials cannot be hard-coded. So for some organizations, you may need to invest in some sort of secrets manager or password in order to make that happen. And lastly, the most straightforward one, apply role-based access controls and least privilege principles to those service and application accounts. So the next scenario, we're going to go over one aspect of cryptography. If you're considering looking at your cryptographic controls or architecture, one consider if you're using hashing to obfuscate PAN, the DSS now requires that a cryptographic keyed hashing algorithm must be used. And the most common example that we see is HMAC. Unfortunately, there's no customized approach objective available for this one. So this one, if you're using hashing, there's no way to get around this. For simply explained, looking at the diagram, traditional hashing, there is a input into the protocol and the hash output is one, let's say A5777 in this case. If you put in the same value with that message authentication code, in this case, it would be a cryptographic key. It would be a different output than a first output. And what this does is if an attacker is aiming to brute force if an attacker was able to exfiltrate the hash values of credit cards within your database in order to brute force and make attempts to guess and make matches of those cardholder data values, they would need to have the key as well. So you might be asking, what about salted hashes? Salts essentially solve this problem. When we're going through the guidance, the PCI SSE emphasizes that there's a need for a separate control system to add an additional layer to the defense in depth approach. More specifically, the concern that they have is that if the database was already breached or the database engine access controls that led to the breach of that content was already breached, there's a high likelihood that the salted values may be accessible as well, depending on especially if the salted values are stored in the same manner. Scenario number 5 is for multi-tenant service providers. There's a new concept called multi-tenant service providers that wasn't present in 3.2.1. And the big change is that there's a broadened scope of applicability for the requirements in Appendix A. In 3.2.1, Appendix A1 really just focused on shared hosting providers, your cloud providers, those that had some layer of the operating system under you. But if your environment was sitting on top of that, you had direct administration responsibilities for that environment. In 4.0, that A1 has been expanded to apply to many more organizations, not just hosting providers, but any service provider that has quote unquote multi-tenant. So this also includes organizations where even if the customer has no administrative responsibilities, or it's not, an infrastructure as a service, maybe you're even providing a software as a service, this actually applies as well. A couple of the SSE example organizations that the SSE provides are SaaS providers, e-commerce or shopping cart services, payment applications, data aggregation points that lead to connections to payment processors. So this is a significant change, especially for service providers. Overall, the overarching theme in A1 is that customers can only have access to their own data. Logging features are provided to customers, and service providers support in vulnerability management incident response so that their underlying infrastructure does not impact, vulnerabilities in their underlying infrastructure does not impact, or at least impacts the customers less as much as possible. So the key takeaway here is take some time to review Appendix A1 if you think this might be applicable to you. What we'll go over next are the net new requirements in addition to the 3.2.1 Appendix A1 controls. The first one is regarding reporting and addressing incidents and vulnerabilities. There's now an expectation that the service provider or the multi-tenant service provider provides some sort of secure channel for customers who are using their service to report any vulnerabilities or any indicators or potential incidents, and that these reports will be ingested by the service provider, and there's some sort of process for addressing and remediating any incidents or vulnerabilities that come as a report. The next area of controls that are net new is customer access authorization. Essentially, the key intent is that providers are the third-party service provider cannot access the environment that the customer is responsible for. For instance, if you're using a cloud hosting provider, the cloud hosting provider needs to have some sort of authorization from the customer if they want to enter or access the nodes that are on top of the host at the bottom. And then on the flip side, customers need to have authorization before accessing the provider's environment. So basic access controls and authorization controls for using that infrastructure as a whole. The last key change in Appendix A is the requirement for tenant segmentation testing. So this one is going to be a bit bigger and more resource intensive, where with any logical separation between customers or customer environments, depending on what type of services you're providing, there has to be some sort of segmentation testing or penetration testing occurring every at least 6 months to verify that. This can be in the form of, let's say, if we're verifying that one customer cannot access another customer's data, it would be in the form of web application penetration testing to test those authentication and authorization logic and controls behind that. So scenario 6, for those of you considering or interested in multi-factor authentication changes, the key change here is twofold. Number one, in 4.0, multi-factor authentication is now required for all access into the CVE. Previously, it was only required for non-console access for administrators and all remote access. But now, any entry into the CVE, multi-factor authentication should be enforced. And there's also another interesting requirement added regarding a secure MFA solution, essentially making sure that the solution that you're using has a secure implementation, is not susceptible to replay attacks, and it can't be bypassed or easily disabled without having some sort of process to make sure that there's visibility into when that's disabled and making sure that there's integrity in the implementation, essentially. Okay, and password policies, this is a hot topic. So for the minimum length and complexity, there's some interesting language changes here. If you can see 8.3.1, it now says if passwords and passphrases are used, which is sort of going where the industry is going, moving away from the use of passwords and passphrases. But in the case that your organization would use passphrases in 2025, the minimum length is now extended to 12 characters, unless 8 characters is the maximum for that particular system, right? If there's some sort of old system that legacy system that you're maintaining. And of course, there's numeric and alphabetical characters. So for the password rotation side, though, this is not necessarily identified as a new requirement. It is a reworded one, at least from the perspective of what the SSC has documented. But this is, I think this is essentially a new requirement where password rotation is no longer required if passphrases, if multi-factor authentication is required. Given our last slide, given that multi-factor authentication is required for all access into the CDE now, this might not be the case because password rotation is only required now if passphrases are the only authentication factor for user access. So if it is the only authentication factor in use, you'd have to either rotate it every 90 days or use, they word it as the security posture of accounts is dynamically analyzed, which is a bit nebulous, but essentially what they're pointing to is using some sort of tool that would, something like user behavior analytics tools that can monitor the activity of users using that account and identify any anomalies or indicators of compromise or any indicators that those credentials have been stolen. And many more requirements. So we weren't able to go through all of them in detail, but what we were able to share are some key changes that would cover a lot of common scenarios. Feel free to ask us if you need any help interpreting any of these, but there are a good amount of changes in 4.0, and we'd be happy to help you out. So, Christina, I'll pass it over to you to move to the next slide.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Bill. So really, as everyone can see, there's a reason why the council has an enforcement date of March 2025. It's not just a change in nomenclature, rather a change in philosophy of how organizations approach PCI with its targeted risk analysis and expectations around technical control implementation and supporting documentation. So this is why we recommend the following approach. We understand organizations like to adopt things a little bit earlier at times, but as mentioned, there's a lot of key changes here. So we recommend in 2022, take a pause, understand and evaluate 4.0 and how it directly affects the organization by performing a readiness assessment, creating a timeline associated with what the organization needs to do from a culture, process, technology, and control perspective, and then look at in 2023 implementing and modifying those controls, again, either documentation or technical. And then if you wanted to adopt it early, start to certify against 4.0 earliest late 2023, but really recommend that 2024 aspect. Still, it's in advance of the March 2025 date, but at least it gives you time to make sure that you have all the right documentation formalized, communicated, implemented, and the right controls, as Bill is mentioning, web application testing, looking at your access control in regards to if you're using passwords, moving to that 12 password dynamic and how it's rotated and monitored and everything. And so we do recommend this kind of phased approach to, methodically evaluate how it impacts the organization instead of just going ahead and adopting it pretty quickly at that early stage. So with that, I think Bill answered most of the questions that were coming up in the queues as we were going through. So thank you, Bill, for being as thorough as you were with the really the technical details and just the approach you used for discussing some of the key changes, especially on the technical side when it comes to the controls themselves. Definitely appreciate that. We do have, if anybody's interested, we do have a series of blog posts that we have posted on our website. So feel free and look at some of our, payments content that we have available itself. So a couple of these are already out there. Some are going to be released within the next month. So there's going to be a lot of details that we are going to be releasing in the next couple of months and continue to do so in regards to critical changes for 4.0. So any feedback you all have, if there's anything that you want to hear more of, if you want us to double click on one of the specific requirements or a set of the requirements and do an additional webinar or a one-off, just let us know and give us that feedback. We're more than happy to do so. But in the meantime, you know, if you do have any questions or want a deeper dive into any of the changes, please feel free to reach out to Bill, myself, or your named account director. And with that, we appreciate everyone's time today, and thank you for joining.